Welcome. Hello everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's question and answer panel discussion. Is sign language interpreted theatre effective? Does it work? My name is David Bellwood. I should disclose some interests from the get-go. I think that's only fair. I am the access manager at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, just down the river. It's a lovely theatre, go visit it, £5 a ticket. Which means that I am responsible for booking sign language interpreted performances, which is something that the Globe still does on a regular basis. I am also on the Board of Trustees at SLITheatre. And as will be coming up, in my role at the Globe, I do employ Theatre Sign, which is a company who does sign language interpretation for stage. I knew people would arrive right now. Just before we get going, a couple of housekeeping notes. There is a hashtag, obviously. We've all been to these conversations before. It's brilliant when they are engaged with by people outside. The horrible thing about the speech-to-text relay is that I can see how many grammatical errors I make as I make. Horrible. The hashtag is hashtag SLITheatre17. That's SLITheatre17. The entire proceedings of this afternoon, that's 2 hours, will be filmed. So if you don't want to appear on camera, sit at the back. And then if you're worried that you have appeared on camera, let me know at the end. We're running this slightly differently to some Q&As because obviously there's a mixture of deaf and non-deaf people. I myself am not deaf. My sign language skills are not good enough to chair this in sign language, so I'm relying obviously on the interpreters. But there will be some pauses. We're going to start off with the first hour being direct questions from me after a series of presentations from the panel, and then in the second half we're going to field questions from the floor. Each panel member will get 5 minutes to present their thoughts, their feelings about sign language interpretation for theatre, or anything else they want to present, indeed. So with no further ado, I've done enough. I'm going to present you to our panel. To your furthest left, we have Max Barber. Max is a budding writer-producer in theatre and film, and has been involved with Definitely Youth and Hub for about 2 years. He recently completed a degree in philosophy and English literature, where he came across a number of plays and a number of struggles to access those plays. He enjoys a wide variety of theatre and often attends caption shows with huge preference for creativity within the accessibility of said shows. Then next along we have Paula Garfield. Paula co-founded Definitely Theatre in 2002 with the aim of putting British Sign Language centre stage. She has led and been artistic director of the company since then. Paula is a passionate advocate for seeing more deaf people on stage and wants to see more drama, acting, directing, training opportunities for deaf people. She is an avid theatre goer and regularly attends performances that include British Sign Language. Her greatest wish is to improve deaf people's enjoyment and appreciation of theatre, and to pass on her love of theatre to future generations of deaf people, including her own 2 deaf daughters. To my right, your left, we have Michael Richardson. No, we don't. We have Louis Neathling. My apologies. Louis is a director-producer who... It's just written in the wrong order. Director-producer who has worked in television and film for over 20 years. His company, Mutt and Jeff Pictures, is very proud to work with existing and up-and-coming deaf talent for both cast and crew. In his dream production scenario, all the cast and crew would be deaf. In his spare time, he goes to captioned and sign theatre, the cinema, and he swims. Then to your right, my left, we do have Michael Richardson. Michael has worked as a theatre director for over 20 years, with a particular focus on work with young people. In 2007, he started to work with deaf young people from Donaldson's in Edinburgh, and then began to learn British Sign Language to get to know the deaf community in Scotland. He is interested in how, as theatre makers, we can produce work that is accessible to deaf audiences, and is now doing a PhD at Heriot-Watt University researching that topic. And then to your extreme right, we have Sula Gleeson. Sula has been an interpreter for a long time and qualified for around 10 years. She has always loved theatre, having been taken to see it from the age of about 18 months. So to combine both this love and her work as an interpreter seemed natural, and she wanted to help deaf BSL users to be able to access the magic of theatre. She has been involved in signed performance in theatre, SPIT, to bring the opinions and attitudes of interpreters to this body. Since then, Split has evolved into signed culture, and Sula is still involved with them. So please welcome our panel. Lovely cricket-like applause there. So to begin with, we're going to have the short presentations.
Thank myself. So, my name is Paula Garfield. This is my sign name. Firstly, thank you for my introduction, David. I've worked as Artistic Director for Definitely Theatre for a long time, and I'm one of 3 co-founders of Definitely Theatre. I was born and grew up profoundly deaf, so I'm an avid regular theatre goer, as I was an actress for 10 years, a freelance actress. So of course actors should go to the theatre and watch different actors working and learn from their skills. And of course, knowing that I wanted to become a director, I wanted to go to various shows to learn these skills too. I take my 2 deaf children to see theatre and usually go with friends and families. It's a big part of my life, and it's been a big part over my years. Have I been 100% satisfied with the accessibility? No. I had this frustration. So last year in April I thought, right, I'm going to put a video up on social networks, on my Facebook to be precise, and expressed my views and frustrations as a deaf BSL sign language user that went to sign language interpreted performances. For me, it's important as a deaf director and actor to have good access to these shows. I filmed this video, put it on Facebook, online. Am I a popular person? Not really. But I had 135 comments. I've never been that popular before. But also I had 34 shares of this video, which was quite a surprise for me. And within these comments, there were a lot of surprises. Joe from Unlimited approached me and said, well, why don't you set up something to start the debate or discussion? Because a lot of deaf people, it seemed, wanted to bring up this discussion and talk about it. And that style of BSL sign performances was the same, and it had been the same for 30 years. And I can see some nodding heads in the audience. With my work at Definitely Theatre, we receive lots of emails from theatres that ask us if we can swap or share their BSL sign performances. But do deaf patrons go? Do they go to sign language performances? Not so sure, which is why I wanted to bring this up in this discussion. I have a list of frustrations with signed theatre. When I sit in a theatre, do I enjoy it straight away when there's a sign language interpreter? No. I need about 10 minutes to adjust to the sign language interpreter's style of sign. I need to work out very quickly who that interpreter is signing for, which character, for example. And so I don't understand things straight away. It takes me a little while to adapt. It takes me about 10 minutes on average to start getting an understanding. I also find it very difficult to watch the interpreter and watch the actors. It's like playing a tennis match. I'm constantly going back and forth. And so many of the actors speak so quickly, and the interpreter has to sign every single actor. And it's like they're running a marathon. I can just see steam coming off their hands. Some interpreters have actually admitted that they've had to remove some lines. It was impossible to translate, or even impossible to sign in that time. There's been so many interpreters that have come into meetings with me and have said, I can't interpret a 1-hour meeting without a break. And I thought, isn't it ironic that theatre interpreters sign an hour and a half? Or even longer. So I asked interpreters and said, why do you need a break? And I was informed that after a certain amount of time, the quality and standard of the sign language interpretation drops. And so surely that must be the same for these sign language interpreters on stage interpreting these shows. That in turn affects the deaf patrons in the audience. Sometimes I choose to ignore what's going on stage and just watch the interpreter, and then forget that there's all these actors on stage. And I don't know what's going on. I want to immerse myself in this performance and see the emotional journey of every single character and actor on the stage, and that's impossible when you're bouncing back and forth on the action and the interpreter themselves. Sometimes you see a little logo saying it's signed on a leaflet advertising the show, but it never actually says who the interpreter is. Sometimes you see what actor is in the performance, and you go to the performance because you like that actor. But most of the time, you don't know who the interpreter is, and even when you call box office, they don't know themselves, and they have to ask their manager, and they never call back. It's very difficult for deaf people to even make that first call initially and ask that question. I've been to theatre with friends and watched the interpreters, and that person said, I don't like that interpreter, I don't like that style of interpretation, but has to watch it anyway. A lot of interpreters themselves don't actually have time to rehearse with the actors. They're brought in and have to sign, normally put into the corner of the stage, and it's very, very separate from what's going on, and they're forced to sign very quickly. What I have seen is integrated performances with the interpreter and working into the action. But a lot of actors don't like the interpreter following them, and the interpreter in turn is suffering. Because the actor, at the moment, is finding their space and enjoying their space, and having the interpreter in that space can be a conflict. Within West End commercial theatre productions like The Lion King, for example, or Phantom of the Opera, Matilda. I can't spell it. This is the sign for it. Matilda. Grease, Warhorse. These various productions are so visual, so of course it attracts a big deaf audience, because there's so much to see, and everyone knows these stories, and they don't have to rely completely on that sign language interpreter. My focus is text-heavy performances, new plays, new playwrights, modern plays I go to see, contemporary plays. So I don't want to talk about commercial West End, because it's a very different conversation. I could go on and on about my frustrations, and what I've said already are just a few of my frustrations. So I don't want to bore you. I don't want to send you to sleep. Do I have a solution? Well, I have an idea. I think all theatre venues that promote captioned or sign language performances need to engage with their deaf communities, communicate with the deaf communities. If you hand out the flyers to the deaf community with a little sign language interpreter logo, most of the time that deaf patron won't be interested. Why? Because there's so many choices now in comparison to 30 years ago. There's more opportunities, there's more opportunities to go to things with better access. You have to think about how to bring those deaf patrons into your venues. There's a lot of deaf actors out there. Why are we not empowering these deaf actors to use their skills to sign the shows? Why does the interpreter not take a seat in the audience and work together with a deaf interpreter? Actually, let me start again. Why can't the interpreter work with the deaf actor? Look at the translation, work out a translation together. That deaf actor translates on stage or interprets on stage, and the interpreter works with them, opposite them, in the audience. You're then using both skills. And that deaf person has a profile within the deaf community, so will probably attract some people themselves. That deaf person represents the deaf community. Do interpreters represent the deaf community? No. Deaf people do. The interpreters just provide the access. The Tate Modern, everyone knows the famous Tate Modern gallery. They have regular BSL talks once a month. And I'd say on average 30 to 40 people, deaf people, come and see these speaks. The reason for this is because the speaker is deaf themselves. The Tate Modern has a training programme for deaf people to train to become speakers. The Tate Modern, every month, has these speaks. 15 years it's happened, and that's because of these deaf speakers. It attracts a deaf audience because they know who these speakers are, and they have this relationship already with them. And I think that should be the same for theatrical interpreters. I'm just going to wrap it up now. I'll wrap up 1 minute. I think theatre venues should also think about setting up a deaf forum, a focus group. Find out what the deaf community and deaf people want. What plays would they like to see? I want to encourage more directors to work or collaborate with deaf artists, deaf directors, and people that generally want to involve deaf people in the production, and not just employ one deaf actor for a tokenistic effect. Something, deaf actors and hearing actors working together as a company, so deaf communities feel genuinely represented. As I said, I had 135 comments on this video, and so one comment I've got here that I thought I'd mention. This person said, theatre companies need deaf people within that company to contribute to the core theatre strategy. The programme needs to be more deaf inclusive. We need to make sure that the deaf production is accessible as a whole production. It would be more cost effective, but we need a range of more senior management to learn to be fully open-minded in how to change it and how to integrate deaf people into their programme. We need more senior managers to speak to their deaf staff and make a change within their companies. It's important to push artists' boundaries. Anyway, there's no real excuse for excluding deaf people and their opportunities to work within mainstream theatre management experiences, working their way up to the top. Thank you very much.
And we're ready for Max? Max is happy. Thank you for that, Paula. Thank you also for sort of introducing the tone of today, which hopefully will be a very welcoming, safe tone for everyone. So obviously there are going to be a lot of remarks which people disagree with, but hopefully we can disagree politely and happily with each other. Disagree happily? Is that a thing we can do? Hopefully. I'm going to return to Max now.
We're finally sorted, everybody. So is everybody ready? Everybody with me now? Yeah? So I'll start again for another time. So I'm Max. I have had many conversations with Paula. And back in August, Paula said to me that she was very interested in finding out what the deaf community or people who access theatre in BSL or English, what their views are on caption performances or sign language interpreted performances. So I decided to conduct a survey. This is because of conversations that I've had. There's been lots of conversations with deaf people, BSL users and hard of hearing people, that issues that they may have accessing theatre. And there's been no survey or research that's been done to date about how many people access captioning, how many people prefer that over BSL. So really, this is the first step into uncharted waters. I do need to let you all know I'm not a PhD student. I'm not Dr. Max Barber. This is just some preliminary research. This data is not to be taken for fact, it's just to be taken at face value. This is kind of just a rough estimate of people who reply to my survey's views. So as you can see from my pie chart, there are many BSL users, which includes deaf, hearing and hard of hearing patrons. We're focusing on this group as a majority. We had 87 responses. So this means we didn't go into the different use of sign language, SSE, sign-supported English. So this data isn't as in-depth as I would have liked. If anyone would like to ask me any questions later, I will be more than happy to answer them. Obviously, I've got only a short time up here, so I'll just give you a whistle-stop tour. So from the BSL using demographic, the most preferred form of access, as we can see, is deaf theatre. And by this I mean integrated theatre, actors who are on stage using BSL. That was the most preferred form of theatre. A close second was captioned performances, and then we take a big steep drop to BSL interpreted performance. So it seems that the majority prefer either integrated theatre or captioned performances. One of the questions was, what type of access do you use most? And this is where the data came back quite ambiguously. Was it because people go because that's what they prefer to use as access, or was what was most available? The majority, over a third, access captioned performances regularly. Not many go to BSL interpreted performances. There was quite a lot of integrated theatre, but this is potentially because the BSL users know that there's performances such as Tommy or definitely performances or reasons to be cheerful, and by word of mouth throughout the community they attend these performances. However, with BSL interpreted shows and captioned performances, they are something that is being used and accessed by members of the BSL using community. The final question was asking which area there's not enough provision. The overarching answer was that deaf people wanted more BSL integrated / deaf theatre. This was a multiple choice question. People could pick as many options as they liked. So obviously there was a mixture of feedback. But I noted that it was normally BSL or integrated theatre with captioned performances. Of course, if BSL is featured within the performance itself, that negates the need for a BSL interpreter. If you'd like to know the precise statistics, do come and speak to me later and I will provide them with you. My general conclusions from this survey are as follows. There is a clear preference for captioned performances or BSL integrated performances. The majority would not attend a BSL interpreted performance. It seems that deaf patrons would like to see language being used on the stage that they can access directly. This can be actors on the stage using BSL or captions. An interpreted performance is always going to be a translation, and there's sometimes unsurety about whether or not you trust the translation, and also the quality of interpreters that are provided are not always the same. The majority of people who did not state BSL as their first language, who said that they were SSE users or were oral, they preferred captioned performances. Some did select BSL interpreted performances, but within their comments they qualified that there should be BSL interpreted shows for deaf BSL users. So they were stating this need on behalf of others, not for something themselves would want. They believed it was a provision that should be there. So in the end, my final question was leaving a comment box. And 87 people replied. And some people do like to waffle on ever so slightly, and then some people have little words. The overall theme was that some people need information provided on BSL interpreted provision. They don't know that it's happening, so there's not enough publicity. Within London, there is a lot of information, and a lot of it comes through the grapevine within the community. But if you go out to people who are not part of the community, they don't get this information. One criticism of interpreted performances was that people cannot understand what character is being interpreted at what moment. It's very difficult to access the play by this. Even if the interpreter is of a good quality, they feel that it's not an accessible medium. And finally, the onus should be on venues to have a better level of promotion for their accessible performances. I don't really know what's going on here on the screen. Talking about accessibility of actually booking the tickets, having online box offices. And like Paula said earlier, sometimes we're often handed a leaflet with the emblem for sign language interpreters, and some people don't know what that means, or they don't know who it is. So sometimes you need this information translated into BSL. And having images, making it clear and accessible what performance will be interpreted, which will not be, having more provision. Better times. Sometimes we're given performances, but they're in the middle of the day. There's so much more that we can go on to say, and if you do want to know more, please do come and talk to me. Unfortunately, I cannot give you the copy of my research as it is currently confidential. So thank you all, and that was a whistle-stop talk.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Max. That's a shame you can't share it. I was going to see if we could put the graphs on the hashtag SLITheatre17, which I am going to be saying. Okay, I'm going to hand over now to Mike, if that's okay. I presume you're speaking rather than signing. Brilliant. Thanks. Okay.
So I'm going to be very quick because most of what I have to say, Paula and Max have already said. Apologies to the interpreters, I'm going to then therefore go slightly off script in the second half. Sorry. So as David said at the beginning, I'm doing a PhD researching the participation of deaf people in theatre, which was triggered because I was working in theatre and deaf people started to come into the room I was working in. And I'd tried quite a few different approaches of working with deaf people on stage, but it was always linked to how can we create an interesting performance. So it was always from a director's perspective and from a hearing director's perspective. And I realised after a few years that actually deaf people weren't coming to see the work that I was doing, and I needed to start to think more about how deaf people were looking at the way that sign language was being used in theatre, and that's why I went back into academia to do my PhD. Now, at the time that I started, one of the theatres in Scotland actually came to my department and said, would somebody do some research on why deaf people don't come to sign language interpretive performances? So although that's not the main focus of my PhD, I did that study as a kind of preliminary piece of work. And around the same time, some interpreters in Scotland were starting to say, I'm not sure this works very well. And it was also clear that in academia, nobody had actually ever asked any deaf people what they thought about interpretive performances. So all the work in academia about theatre interpreting has been done with other interpreters. So there's been stuff like the work that Max has done and surveys that Sign Performance in Theatre has done, but actually written up in academia, this is new. So I took a group of people to see a show that was interpreted. I took 5 deaf people and 5 hearing people, and after the show I sat with each of those groups for over an hour and we talked about the concept of interpreted theatre, about the play that we had been to see, and about access issues generally. We didn't talk about the specific interpreter and the work that she had done because nobody in either of those groups was bilingual, so nobody had any access to the source text and the interpreted rendition. So everything I say is not based on the performance of a particular interpreter. And also I should say that the show that we went to see is of that very particular touring circuit model, where the show comes in for a week, the interpreter sees it for the first time on a Tuesday evening, and they have to do their own performance of it on the Friday evening or the Saturday afternoon. And they're positioned by the venue off to the side, usually not even on the stage in theatres in Scotland, either on the auditorium floor or outside the proscenium arch. So this is a very particular model, which is my view first, seems to be particularly ineffective. And I know it doesn't reflect the way theatre interpreting is done everywhere, but I think it raises a lot of questions, and it certainly triggered a huge amount of discussion. What I also did in the research was interview the interpreter about how the interpreted performance is set up by the theatre venues. I also interviewed 2 people from the theatre venue about that. The only people I didn't get to talk to were the theatre company, but the theatre venue staff had a lot to say about the theatre companies and their attitude towards the work. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that my deaf group gave exactly the same and more feedback as what Paula was just talking about and what Max's respondents came back with in his questionnaire. So I'm not going to go over all of that again. So I'm going to summarise a bit and then put some ideas out about what might be behind the issues. So basically the results came back in sort of 2 sets. There was quite a lot of unexpected feedback about what happens around the performance, marketing, box office, front of house, all of this kind of stuff, which basically boils down to the fact that all the staff in the theatres that I was working with are hearing and have no concept whatsoever of how the deaf community functions or how to access the deaf community and what's relevant to the deaf community. So things like, who is the interpreter? That's just like a hearing person saying, who's the actor? But also, how do you find out about a show if it's advertised on a written English website that as a deaf person you don't normally go on? So there's no attempt to find deaf people in their own space and to communicate with them in BSL. So lots of issues around that. The factors that lie outside the performance, and then also all the things that have been talked about already about the space that the interpreter's in, problems with translation because of omissions. That came from the interpreter, not from the deaf group, because of the amount of time that you're actually interpreting. And also issues around the inadequacy of training for interpreters who want to work in theatre. So some interpreters who I've spoken to since have said categorically they received no training whatsoever in translation. Not even for other settings, but just the ideas around what makes a good translation is not included in interpreter training. It's obviously a massive lack if you're going to be translating a piece of theatre. This is literary translation and really complex. So there are training issues for interpreters, both in translation but also in their performance skills. And even today, before we started, there was a conversation happening where people were saying, well, some people are good performers, they're just good performers, but other interpreters are not. But if you don't train interpreters to do that, then you can't expect that they will be able to perform. But if you sell a ticket to a deaf person to see a show, then they expect that the people they are looking at will be able to perform and will in some way match what is happening on stage. And interpreters don't get the training for that. Now, I think there's some fundamental issues, and this is why I'm going off script, so I'm going to refer to my very recent notes. I think one of the things that's a problem, so this kind of theatre interpreting has been around for about 30 years. And there's a report in a library not very far from here, written by the National Theatre the year after they put on their first sign language interpreted performances. And it has two lists in it. One is a list of successes, and the other is a list of things we need to do next. Like, let's get the interpreters into lots more rehearsals. Let's think better about how we build the interpreting into the design aesthetic of the show. The situation now in most interpreted theatre that I'm aware of is that we don't even fulfil all the things that were on the list of successes in 1990. So we've taken a step back. And I think there are issues there around what's become common sense in theatre and what's become affordable. So it's obviously relatively affordable to book one interpreter at short notice and stand them over there in black. It's less affordable to bring them into rehearsals. And the common sense that's built up around that is that's accessible. We know that's accessible because it is, because we all do it, and if people were doing different things, then maybe we'll question that. But because we all do that, then it must be right. And this is a huge problem because the hardest thing to change is the thing that everybody thinks is common sense. So what we need to change is not placing the interpreter over there, but the thinking behind that everybody thinks that's normal and that it works. And an additional problem in making that change is that the people who work in theatres and theatre companies don't have the communication tools to question that. They can't even evaluate the service. They can't sit in the audience and say, oh, that was a bit rubbish. And as a result, and one of the access staff in the theatre I've worked in doesn't go ever to BSL interpreted or captioned performances and couldn't tell me where the captions were positioned in her theatre when a caption show was on. And they were in a box, so even less visible than the interpreter position. So there's a real issue, and the response when I said, well, you could set up a deaf theatre group, the kind of thing Paula was talking about was, we have no budget for that. So the situation is that funders who buy into this common sense demand access, but they give a limited pot of money, and it's not enough. And it's certainly not enough to further explore what the issues are from within the theatres. So it just gets a low priority. I think the last thing I'll say is that as a result of the research that I did, the two theatres I worked in agreed to talk to an organisation in Scotland that runs a deaf theatre club, and it was working in Glasgow, and now Deaf Theatre Club works in lots of theatres around Scotland, including the ones I did my work in. What Deaf Theatre Club provides is a front of house service. It doesn't influence what shows are interpreted or what kinds of shows are represented as being accessible. It doesn't influence who the interpreters are. It's not involved in training, nothing like that. It's a service that sits between the theatre and deaf patrons. It's more like a deaf club that goes to the theatre than deaf people going into the theatre to influence what's going on. And the response of the access officer in the theatre was, fantastic, that's off my plate now. Someone else will deal with that. Because she's too busy also dealing with the merchandise. And that's where it sits in those theatres. So I think there are real issues around the ideologies that sit inside theatres that need tackling, as well as all the issues on the surface that we're already talking about. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. I'm looking forward to the day that the Globe gives me responsibilities over merchandise. The stuff I would sell. Yeah. Anyone following the hashtag SLITheatre17 might think that we're heading on a very downward negative path. So I'm going to ask Louis to present next, if that's okay. He might have a slightly different viewpoint, or exactly the same one.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be a participant on this panel. I'm not here representing a group or an organisation. I'm just here as an individual who's an avid theatre goer who's used both captioned performances and BSL interpreted performances to access the shows that I go to see. This is my personal view. So if I go to book a performance online, be it BSL interpreted, captioned or integrated, when I go to choose, there's a lot of things that go through my mind. I go to the theatre with my family and my friends to switch off and enjoy the performance. That's my overarching aim. I want to laugh, I want to cry, and go on the same emotional journey as all the other audience members. When it's a captioned performance, and I sit down and take my seat, and the performance begins, I feel disengaged. For example, I went to see A Winter's Tale. It's a Shakespeare play. This was at the RSC. I took my seat. It's not a play I know well. I know other works by Shakespeare, but this is not one that I knew about. I wasn't taught about it at school. I read the synopsis before the play began, as many other people would. So, okay, I've got the gist, I know what it's about. Really excited, the lights went out, curtains rolled back. I thought, the set looks quite nice. The actors came on stage, and I thought, oh, the captions, they're not in a very good position. So I was trying to concentrate, and then everybody around me started laughing. I was like, what are you all laughing at? Look back at the caption. I couldn't find anything funny on there. And the longer the performance went on, the more disengaged I came back. And the worst point was when Autolycus came on the stage, due to the intonation and the play on words, everybody started laughing. But when I looked at this English caption, I couldn't understand why it was funny. And I realised it was to do with the actor's performance. If that was just a word said in just a very monotonous voice, none of the audience members would have laughed. And that's the access I was receiving. I don't know if I can say I enjoyed that performance. I didn't have the same experience as everybody else sat in the audience. Another performance I went to see at the National, called Antigone, written by Sophocles, a Greek playwright. This was adapted to be set within the Cold War era. The set, it's very plain, very simple. It's a bare stage. The performance began, and it was a very dialogue-heavy piece. Watching across this plain set, with the actors not doing much movement, I think I should have just stayed at home and read it. That's the experience I had. I'm not anti-caption performances. I do enjoy them. Like when I go to the cinema, I'll watch a subtitle performance. The schedule and the options are limited. So sometimes I have to go without the captions. There's only a choice of once, and it's the same across theatre and cinema. Sometimes I go just because I want to go out and I've got plans with my friends and my family, and I may know the play well, or I may know the film well, and I can enjoy it. But often I have to watch it again so that I can understand fully what had happened, with captions or subtitles. The experience of going out with my friends and my family is often scarpered by the poor provision of access or the bad timing. Captioned theatre. Always, often, I go off to talk to everybody afterwards. They said, "Oh, did you enjoy it?" And I say, "Well, what would you prefer? Sign language interpreted or captioned?" The views I get are wide and varied. Some people prefer captions, some people prefer interpreters. People who are losing their hearing through age or are deafened or are not part of the deaf community prefer captioned performances. But I often find deaf BSL users who don't have access to English prefer sign language interpreted performances as they cannot access the captions. There's never one person who says the same as somebody else. The deaf community is very diverse and our access needs are just as diverse. Recently, I booked to see Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. There's only one captioned performance a year. Last month in October, I finally got my ticket. But I was told that I had to see both performances, both halves, in one day. I had a rather sore bottom at the end. I wanted to have that break in between and the option to see part 1 and part 2 on different days. And that was not something I could do. I sometimes feel that we are treated as second-class citizens. They get our access needs over and done with in a day. Are we not worth the same as all other theatre goers? Recently I saw an interpreted performance, and this is at the Globe. A Midsummer's Night's Dream. Oh, actually, no, 12th Night. Director and performer Mark Bryceland. He directed this one. We had the interpreter, and it was Peter Llewellyn-Jones. His positioning was perfect. The translation was a dream. I really was immersed in this performance. And I remember it was raining that day, and Peter stood there, half covered by the roof and half soaked. It was a perfect line down the middle of him. Did he stop? Did he move? No. He continued. It was about access. It wasn't about him and his ego. And that's one of my most memorable performances that I've ever seen, especially one that was interpreted. At the Soho Playhouse, I went to see Blue Eyes and Heels. It's a comedy. I was apprehensive before I went. It wasn't a well-known West End play. I asked who was interpreting. I was told it was Russ Alderson. So, comedy's normally very fast-paced, very snappy. It's all about the timing and the punchlines. Will the interpreter be able to keep up? He did. It was a beautiful interpretation, and I always felt that I was on at the same time as the actors. I wasn't being left behind. Another wonderful experience was at the RSC. Christmas suits. So Christmas truce. It was an integrated, or semi-integrated performance. It was the first time I felt I really could relax. Normally I have the interpreter off to the side. It's a bit of a Wimbledon situation. You're looking at the actors and then the interpreters. Whereas this one, we had the interpreter in the middle, in between the two actors. That was one of the most enjoyable interpreted performances. Again, it wasn't about the interpreter's ego. It was about the provision of access. The second time I went to see it, quite recently, it was a semi-integrated performance. I really enjoyed that. I'm not always thinking, oh, I'll go and see the interpreters. The first thing I do is I find out who the interpreter is before I book my ticket. Are they well known? Or have they got a bad reputation? I'm not going to waste my time. We're very much reliant on skilled interpreters. I have my preferred list and I kind of follow them around. Sometimes I've been told an interpreter's name, never heard of them before. Oh, do you know what, I'll give it a go. And I sat down, and the interpreter sat there on the ground, slouched over like a sack of potatoes. I feel embarrassed. And sometimes you have other interpreters who make it all about them. I was like, oh, no, stop. Dull it down. There's a variety of styles. Sometimes I'm looking at the actors, and there's some jokes. And you can see by the facial expression, it's quite a comedic performance, where the interpreter has provided quite a monotonous interpretation. It's very difficult. I'm very fussy about who I will go and see. I do digress ever so slightly, but I did meet one actor who said to me they're involved with a theatre company who brought interpreters in for accessibility for the deaf and hearing actors, and also because her herself was an interpreter. They ensured that the interpreter was paid the same wage as everybody else, be it an easy job. It was about empowering access on both sides. And this made me think, does this mean the performance interpreters are in decline? Is it because of scheduling issues? Or is it a budgetary issue? Or is it deaf people not attending the performances, preferring integrated performances, or BSL theatre? Is that why there's not as many BSL interpreted performances? I'm an avid theatre goer. It's one of my many hobbies. As soon as the stage comes alive, I feel like it's a magical experience and it's an important part of my life, and it always will be. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Libby. That was very interesting. I hope you got equally as wet as the interpreter. That's why we don't get on. Lastly, in our presentations, I'm going to invite Sula to speak. Sula, you will be talking?
Yep.
Talking. Yep. Excellent. Okay, Sula, thank you.
Oh, hello everybody. So I feel I've got kind of two hats going on now. So I'm speaking as an interpreter who does do interpretive theatre, but also as a representative of signed culture. So maybe I'll give a little bit of background to signed culture in case people don't know who and what we are. So signed culture started life as split signed performances in theatre, which was set up over 20 years ago to advocate and support interpretive theatre. A couple of years ago, we, as a board of the organisation, decided to undertake an organisational review to see if we were still needed and what people thought. So we questioned and asked our 3 stakeholder groups, and in summary, theatres appreciated us being there because they liked the support and guidance that we were giving them. Interpreters liked us because they said it was quite nice to have a sort of representative body. And then deaf people liked us, but they also went one step further and said really they like a one-stop shop that gave them information about everything accessible in the arts. So, deaf community being who we were there for, we went with that and thought, well, okay, we'll try and be that organisation to provide information about theatre, but also art gallery talks, museum tours, and anything else in the arts. So this is what we tried to do, and that's why the name had to change, and we've become Signed Culture. After a lot of discussion and Google searching to see what other names and other companies were using. So, Signed Culture is not an agency. We don't book interpreters or organise interpreters. We just give advice and guidance to basically anybody who wants it. Mostly it's theatres. They contact us saying, oh, we want to do, and actually small theatre companies who say, we'd like to put on an interpreted performance, how do we do it? So that's mostly what we end up advising, but we're there for other things. So that's Signed Culture. There's other things I won't go into. So with Signed Culture hat on, I should be promoting the idea of interpreted theatre, which I do, which we do. However, I'm not a fool. We know interpreted theatre is not perfect, and with the most common form of interpreted theatre, that being what everybody said, the interpreter standing on the side of the stage and a tennis match going on, it's not ideal. However, we still believe there is a place for interpreted theatre in the realm of access to the arts for deaf BSL users. It's part of our advice and guidance that we give out. We try and highlight there are other options, there are pitfalls, and there are alternatives to interpreted theatre or having an interpreter outside of the stage. It's a long journey, but we're trying. With my interpreter hat on, as an interpreter who does work in theatre on occasion, I have my own personal views. That obviously, I have to admit, does bleed into my work with Signed Culture, and I think that's fun. I've attended lots of courses, read lots of books, talked to other theatre interpreters, attended interpreted shows to watch how other people work, and therefore I have quite strong opinions. I am painfully aware of how much work goes into translating and interpreting a show to do it, or should go into interpreting a show, which is why I only ever do a few every year, because it does take over my life for a good few weeks before the night. And therefore it does highlight all the downfalls that people have already been speaking about. I'll kind of list the pros and cons in a very blunt way. If I had more time, I might elaborate and be a bit kinder, but I'm going to be brutal. I do think that not all shows lend themselves to be interpreted. Just not. Maybe not all spaces are suitable to have interpreted shows. I do appreciate there are interpreters to be found working in theatres who aren't good enough to be there. I do understand that there are many deaf people who believe theatre is a strictly hearing thing, and who therefore aren't even curious to venture through the doors. I do realise that many venues, even if they programme an interpretive event, don't think about everything else that surrounds it. So the ease of finding information on their website or anybody else's website, how deaf people would book a ticket, informing frontline box office staff anything about the interpreted performance, not helping their staff with deaf awareness, etc., etc., etc. So to kind of mix my views with Signed Culture, if we had the funding, I would love to be able to work on a few projects. I will just list a couple, just as an example. I would love to establish the theatre domain as a specialist area of work, like it is already for mental health, police, court, etc., etc. I would love to establish some kind of recognised theatre interpreting standard, whether that be a qualification, a certification, something. Publicise the work that theatre interpreters do, or should do, so that venues, theatre companies know and appreciate the workload that's involved, and possibly other interpreters find out. Develop a way to demonstrate different styles or methods to make a show more accessible to the deaf, i.e. it doesn't have to be that person in black standing downstage right. However, because I love the theatre, I have many friends who are actors, I've been involved in various capacities from when I was at college, kind of moonlighting with the drama department and helping provide their tech to final productions and helping children's workshops and tutoring children who are acting in plays, blah, 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 etc., etc. Underneath it all, I just love theatre, and therefore I want everyone to have the opportunity to experience the same thing, to experience the thrill, as Louis was talking about really, of sitting in a darkened room, sharing the experience with those around you, entering a new world, learning what other people feel, as in the people on stage who are portraying it, finding out about people, characters from faraway places, historical ages, bringing stories to life literally in front of your eyes. So you can escape the humdrum reality for a couple of hours and leave the space better off in so many ways. And for the deaf BSL user, I feel this is best done by giving them access through BSL. That can include all those features the printed word cannot.
Thank you. Thank you, Sula. So that was our panel, ladies and gentlemen. There is also a statement from the theatre side who couldn't be with us this afternoon, which will go on the internet, I believe. I'm looking around, no one's nodding at me. I shall make sure that happens afterwards, where they talk about some assumptions which may be made and some assumptions which are wrong about sign language interpretation for the stage. I'm going to ask just 3 questions to the panel, and then I'm going to open up questions to the floor, if that's okay. And Paula, I did actually want to start with you, if you're paying attention. Thank you.
Yes, I am.
We talked a lot about shared experience, and in some ways equal access. So I want to know, how important is it that members of an audience have the same or similar experiences? And, 2-part question, if it is important, is that honestly possible? Is it possible to create the same experience for deaf and non-deaf audiences?
Good question.
Thank you.
Oh, I'll stand up. I've been asked to stand. So yes, I will stand. So do deaf audience members share the same experiences? No, it varies, as it is the same for hearing people. We have different senses of humour, and it's exactly the same for the deaf community as well. Maybe hearing people have brilliant sense of humour to laugh over the tiniest thing, and some patrons don't, and it's exactly the same for deaf audiences. Some hearing audiences are emotional and cry, and some don't. And it's exactly the same with deaf people, and I think that's important to remember. Definitely theatre's aim, I think, is for deaf and hearing audience members to access the same performance and go on the same emotional journey. And not necessarily feel exactly the same journey, but a similar one, have a shared journey.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Mostly. Yeah. I'm going to say yes. And on the back of that, Louis, if I don't mind me moving to you on that, you talked about your family and going on the same journey as the rest of the audience, which is clearly important for you. But where I felt where it was significant to me is that you really enjoyed where the access became artful. Now, should there be a difference between access and art? Or can you make access part of the art?
Stand up. Darren was saying, staring at me, see me.
The audience normally heckle later.
It's an interesting question. Access to art or making access art. I want to have the understanding and I get the humour, access in general, going with my family or my friends, when there's comedic moments and everybody's laughing and I'm not, it's quite a strange experience. I'm the only deaf member of my family. I want to have the same experience. Sometimes access is done in a very artful manner and everybody enjoys it in the same way. And if it's done properly, it's brilliant. Sometimes when you rely more heavily on the interpreter or the caption, you become disengaged and actually you get a bit lost.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think that's quite interesting. The notion that every audience member is unique, and your reaction is going to be unique, but we still have this sense that it's a shared experience, and especially when it comes to families. And maybe there'll be time later to talk about families where not everyone is deaf, or only one person is deaf, which is where you do want to be able to talk about what you've just experienced with your family. Mike, we're going to move on to you now. Because you're just there.
Good luck.
Could I answer?
Do you have a riposte?
No.
Oh.
It's a slightly different view. Which is that the word access comes from the idea of physically accessing a building to then participate in a performance. Participate as audience, or interact with the actors. And I think it's quite important to think of this enticing deaf people into the building, but that's the access. But then there's also the meaningful art that allows them to interact with what's going on stage.
No, like that.
Just throw that in as another.
Was the Ramps on the Moon project worded it as access is inviting me to the party, inclusion is inviting me to dance, which I liked. I like that a lot. Well done there. No, it was really good. But if I may ask you, there are some real challenges, I think, about what you were researching in notions of scale and location. So when we're talking about what solutions work, and Sudha touched on this as well, can the same forms of access, which I'm sorry to use the word, the same forms of access work for receiving houses as much as producing houses? Can it work for smaller regional theatres as much as larger regional theatres? Is there ever going to be a one-size-fits-all solution?
No. Good. And I think that's really important, because there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution for every Shakespeare play, or for every play in the English canon. For every show, the creative team starts from scratch, and the access requirements, I think, should be there from the beginning. How are we going to deal with making this accessible for deaf people, for visually impaired people, not as an add-on at the end? The one-size-fits-all thing is, I think, a huge mistake.
No. Excellent. Any further on that note? So I want to move to Max now, actually, about his research, likewise. I want to know the forms of theatre that your respondents saw. So had they been to mid-scale or quite small regional theatre, or was it large tours, and so on and so forth?
I'll get my papers together. Sorry, I need to stand up. You all need to see me. Forgot about that. So, from my 87 participants, we had a multiple choice question, but most of them said that they have accessed West End shows, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Kinky Boots, Matilda, to name some, and also deaf integrated theatre. That was the type of theatre that they preferred to access and had accessed. It's the same really as you'd find within the hearing demographic. Regional plays, regional theatres, probably half of the participants said they had seen them. And with interactive performances, the numbers decline. Does that answer
That's
your question?
great. Stay standing. Have you come across any deaf patrons or audience members who wanted to attend a play which wasn't accessible and then have specifically requested either sign language interpretation or captioning from a theatre? So do you know any people who have actively asked a theatre to provide access?
This wasn't covered in the scope of the research, but I know some people socially who have done this for cinemas and asked for subtitle showings, but I'm not sure about theatres and requests for access. Louis, if I can just come in on this. There are a couple of plays where I wanted to see, so I phoned the Soho Playhouse. Said, I'd like you to provide an interpreter, because within the run there are no accessible performances. And they said, yep, that's fine. And I came to watch it twice, and they provided me an interpreter on 2 occasions. So I have done that, so that does answer the question. Which theatre was that? Soho Playhouse. I've done that on 2 occasions. Well, I did ask a theatre venue, I can't remember which it was, whether or not they could provide captions, and all I got was a blunt no. I think, I may be wrong, I think a lot of deaf people don't know how to ask for the access they require. We are quite strong, assertive people. We're involved in the arts, whereas the majority of deaf patrons don't know how to get the access they need and don't know how to ask for it. Max, just to add to this, it's important to remember some people are assertive individuals and others are not, but it's also about where people are based. If somebody is in a small village where the biggest theatre capacity is 10 people, and they say, can you provide an interpreter, they may not have the money or the resources in place to make this happen. Obviously, we do have the Equality Act 2010. It's a very broad act. It says reasonable adjustment. Is that in providing BSL interpreters, or is that providing captions? It's quite easy to walk around this as legislation, but it is something to remember that we do have enshrined in law.
That's a really, really interesting point. Sudha, just quickly to you, the hardest question, potentially, because obviously your work involves campaigning and lobbying in many respects, but, and I did say I would be provocative, when just talking to theatres about provisions for deaf people, considering audiences are healthy but considerably smaller than non-deaf audiences, considering a good percentage of deaf patrons have discounted tickets, and considering the current expense of sign language interpretation, is it still economically viable for theatres to invest in sign language as opposed to captioning where the audiences are demonstrably larger?
Yeah, great. Difficult question. Thanks, Matt. It's difficult, and it's to kind of slightly avoid the question. A lot of the questions and emails we get are usually weirdly from very small theatre companies who are doing some little random play somewhere random, and they're all artistic and want to provide access, so they want to do an interpreted performance. And I'm always questioning, it's kind of linked with Max's point in that if somebody's based in a village and the theatre's got 10 people, then it makes it difficult to fork out for an interpreter. But then on the opposite side, we get inquiries from theatre companies or even amateur dramatic people who want to have an interpreted show, and they're in the back end of nowhere. And you go, great, I'm so happy that you want to provide an interpreted show. Who do you think's going to go? Because, deaf people aren't, probably in that village in the middle of nowhere. So it kind of comes from both both ends, as it were. So it's tricky, and part of our advice and guidance is always to suggest to people that they put in, when they're writing their application form for funding, is to remember to stick in, we want to provide access, and therefore that will be that much money. So when they get their funding put on that too, put on the performance in the first place, then they have the money to cover the access. But, yeah, it's tricky.
Thank you for that. Here's a brain teaser for you. Obviously, I'm not meant to talk about my experiences. Not my job, but I'm going to share this one. At the Globe, we were asked to put on sign language interpretation for a group, and they were an American group, so it was American Sign Language which we were asked to provide. Now, brain teaser to the panel, is that just providing playing a different language, or is that still access? I'm going to pause on that one. They can think about that whilst you get to ask your questions. If you do have questions, please raise your hand. There is a mic at the back if you would like to speak into it, or assign to the interpreters, obviously, and I will repeat your questions as best as I can afterwards. There was one right at the front here.
It's been a very interesting debate and discussion. There's a lot of research and a lot that still needs to be done, but all of this will cost money. And good quality access also comes at a cost. I'm wondering where this money can come from, or where is it coming from, and should theatre companies be obliged to put this within their funding applications? How they will cover access, what they will be providing. Should the Arts Council be mandating this as part of an application? And will this encourage more money to be put into this area to ensure that access does become a creative form and is always there from the get-go?
So should money be put aside in each production for access, and specifically sign language access, and also should the ACE have a duty of care to ensure that applications for MPO status or for trusts and funds include sign language provision? Paul is nodding so enthusiastically she might fall off her chair. So do you want to answer that one?
I'm aware that the Arts Council do say that everybody has a responsibility to provide access to the deaf audience members. So they think by bringing in an interpreter or having a caption performance, that's it. They've ticked the box and that's what the deaf community want. It's very frustrating, because when I set up this event, I asked the Arts Council about what statistics they had about how many deaf people go to the theatre, how many choose captions over sign language interpreted performances, and they said, we don't have this information. And they don't know what the deaf community want. There's a lot of assumptions that interpreters or captions are the only two options. There's no engagement. As I said earlier, nobody knows what the deaf community want. Do they want deaf theatre access directly? As Max's research said, it's either deaf actors on the stage, integrated performance, or captions. Do they want to go and see themselves being reflected and represented on the stage?
That's an interesting point. I'd also like to know how many deaf people the ACE employs, which is a question they probably wouldn't answer either. Michael, do you have anything to add on?
I'm going to bring the Scottish perspective. So there are two layers of pressure on arts bodies in Scotland. One is that Creative Scotland, the Arts Council, requires that regularly funded organisations do fulfil some kinds of access requirements, although they're not well defined. It's for the organisations to define how they will do that. But also now we have the BSL Scotland Act, which means that any publicly funded body in Scotland has to be working towards a strategy for making their services available in BSL. So that's also another layer of persuasion on arts organisations. But there was another part to the question, which was about where does the money come from? And one of the things that I think is really important is going back to, I'm going to kind of paraphrase something that Sula said, which is, why do you want to make that show accessible? So pretty much all the theatres in Edinburgh interpret every show once. If it's on for a week, at least a week, it's interpreted once. But you can be pretty sure that there are some things on that list that no deaf people will ever want to go and see. And with a bit more intelligent programming, more money could be put into each of fewer interpreted performances to help to raise the quality. And not just interpret everything because that ticks the box.
It's a very good point. Oh, Louis.
It's very interesting. Having seen various performances, captioned performances seem to become more popular, and there's a decline in interpreted performances. So just going back to the cost question, the cost of interpreters and the cost of the captions, is that the priority, or is it the popularity that's of each of them that's the most important thing? Sometimes is it captions that is cheaper? I'm getting a no. Captions are more expensive than interpreters. Deep is saying from the audience. Okay, so I didn't know that. That's interesting. Thank you. That answers my question.
Oh, do you want to follow up, Kathy, very briefly?
I think stage text provide a lot of advice for theatre captioning and various theatre companies. Do the theatres know where to go for advice, and how do we provide good quality interpreting? Design culture, that's a question for you. Do theatres know where to go to?
So
Can I just add, sorry, just want to jump in on that. You mentioned sign language interpreted performances reducing in comparison to captions. I think a lot of people find it easier to follow captions because it's difficult to follow sign language interpreted because of various factors, where captions are very easier. It's easier to follow. We read as deaf people, we grow up reading subtitles, we watch films with subtitles, and TV with subtitles, and theatre with subtitles. It's the same format. We're bilingual patients. That's my opinion. That's why we're having a reduction. I want to respond to that. I understand your point of view. I understand that it's direct and there's speculation with the right interpretation or translation. But I don't want to be educated and read something like I'm at school. I want to enjoy it. I want to switch off and I want to feel like I'm back in an English lesson. I don't want to go back to school again. I'd rather, if I wanted to do that, I could read a book at home. But at least then I can enjoy my evening watching sign language. That's my opinion. I want to. Thank you. Just through the break, I was talking with someone in the audience, and I realised actually that yes, we're talking about English and captions, but very interestingly, for deaf patrons that go to the theatre, what is their background? The people that go to the theatre, we assume that they've read the play, they've got good English skills. For those that don't have those English skills and their first language is sign language, do they have the knowledge of these theatre productions, and can they have access to the captions? We just think about the demographic of the theatre patrons coming to the theatre and how many are coming. So, is it because they're not going, or because the access isn't provided? It's chicken and egg.
Yeah, I think there are also some interesting points. We should be careful when saying that audiences are larger or smaller for one or the other, because it's difficult for theatres to get data unless there are personal declarations. So I think we should maybe be cautious about saying that the audiences are smaller for one or the other. And just to answer that other question, I think companies like Stage Text make a very good job of being actively going to the theatres and informing theatres about what they can do. 2 questions here. I'm going to start with this one.
I'm only going to reply.
You didn't, Sula. We're running out of time. I'm sorry.
Sign culture.
No, I'll come back to you in a minute.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Hi. I think in theatre, when you have an actor, you don't just give them the script and tell them to go away, translate it, and then come back and do it live on stage. But they are worked with the directors and producers and dramaturgs and everybody. There's movement, and it's an impossible, outdated model that you get an interpreter, you tick a box, They're told to come, have a look, go away and come back. It's impossible. It's impossible. And it's full of anxiety, and I think that's why you've got a reduction of interpreters. You do have some good interpreters out there that have been doing it for a number of years, and so they've built up enough courage to go and stand on a stage and do it. But you've got the Arts Council who have, put in an obligation to people to provide interpreted or accessible theatre, and so you've got many, many productions out there who are looking for somebody to come and do that. So then you get people who will go and do it, but it's a really, really difficult thing to do, because unless you end up working within a team, so you might be lucky enough that there's a deaf actor in the show, and then you have access to other interpreters. You might have some BSL consultation, and they can help you with your translation, and then somebody else might be able to look at your blocking. Then you've got a team. Then you're lucky if you're working within that kind of environment. But I think that the system that we have at the moment with sign language interpreting is outdated, and something like this is fantastic because we can all come together and say, yes, Arts Council, you've put this obligation in, and yes, theatres, you're looking to fulfil it. But I think it's within the deaf community to start saying, actually, yes, okay, we want our access, and some of us want it like this and some of us want it like this, so we need our interpreters to be regulated. They need to be the same as the court interpreters. They need to go through training. They need to have feedback from the deaf community to say whether or not, and obviously everybody's taste is different, and, I think the whole model needs to be relooked at. I think a lot of interpreters will not do it, and then some people who shouldn't do. And I think it's a very, very difficult thing, and I think that's why you've got the decline.
Just to paraphrase that slightly, and to pass it on to you, because you talked about standards, and how do you envisage going about creating that standard, and who polices it? Who are the gatekeepers of great theatre translation?
Well, something we wanted to do, just to put it out there, Sign Culture has no funding. So we haven't got budgets and money to go and do stuff. But if we did, this is something that we'd be looking at. Just to give you an example, we did have a very vociferous voice of a deaf person complaining about a theatre interpreter. No names, no petrol. So we went along to look at the interpreter working, and then got really scared because we went, we actually kind of got no right to assess them because there is no setup for this. But we went along anyway and watched. And interestingly, there were a few deaf people in the audience, and we happened to be sat behind them. And in the interval, we tapped them on the shoulder and said, "What do you think?" And they went, "It's great." And we were kind of going, interesting. What? Why is that then? And they went, she's a theatre interpreter. So it's like she had a label that meant she was good. And we went, okay then. But have you seen any other interpreted theatre? No. Right. So what are you basing that? What are you basing that on? So there is that. There is also, we get questions and queries from these small theatre companies or amateur dramatic companies that say, we haven't got any money, so can we have a volunteer interpreter? So my advice is always no, because if you're going to get a volunteer, if you're a professional qualified interpreter that knows what it is to take on theatre, it's worth something because it's a lot of work. Therefore you wouldn't do it without any pay. If you're going to take on a volunteer, probably they don't know what they're doing, and they're just going to go, yeah, I'll have a go at that, and stand up and have a go, and probably be quite useless. And then the fear is that any deaf people who are brave enough to go along are going to watch a rubbish interpreter and go, this is interpreted theatre? I'm never going to go again. So that's the fear. So we always go, no, please don't go down that route. It's up to you, but please don't. And to go back to the question before, theatres need to come to us because we'll give them this kind of advice, quality guidance. Excellent.
Thank you. I think you had something on the back of that.
Just to throw a couple of things in from academia, there's been a lot of research that suggests that monolingual receivers of an interpreted text will say it's good if it feels good. It can be completely inaccurate, but if the interpreter stands there really confident, then the response will be, yeah, that's good. That's good interpreting. Which links back to the idea of quality and how do you how do you assign quality? Unfortunately, there's almost no research in interpreting studies that defines quality in any field. I was at a conference about a month ago, and there was a whole day of panels like this on quality in interpreting. And at no point during the entire day did anybody mention a single thing that was measurable as a way of assessing quality. It's a really difficult one. And interpreters spend so much time working as the only bilingual person in the room that they're relying on a lot of self-assessment and reflective practice, but there's no sort of objective external measures that are in place at the moment.
Sorry, there's another question here.
So I work at Unlimited, and the reason that we were really interested when Paula put the thing out on Facebook is that we commission people to make art, and we commission disabled artists to make art. Just because you're a disabled artist, it doesn't mean that you've thought about access any more than any other artist, but we do say that artists should look to make their work as accessible as they can within the aesthetic that they're working to. And we got quite a lot of criticism when we started out by saying that, because some people said everything should be accessible to everyone. But we felt that if an artist wanted to make work entirely in the dark, because that was important to that aesthetic, then we couldn't go, you've actually got to have a light one here, because it would ruin that piece. But the main thing that people say to us, particularly around theatre, is, oh, I'll put an interpreter in then, I'll put that budget line in. But we don't think that we're getting that detailed thought about why, or why do that as opposed to this, and what are you doing in the rehearsal process that makes you test that out in your research and development. Do you know that that's the right choice for that piece? Which is why we were really keen to support this event and open up this conversation, because I do think the Arts Council I don't think it's just them, I think we have a tick box mentality because we're all short of time. But I'd be really interested in what advice would the panel give us around how we should commission artists to make work, particularly in theatre work, to make it accessible.
And by us, do you mean Unlimited or the community at large? So.
I'll be generous.
Artists at
Make it
large. So what advice does the panel have for making art which is inclusive and accessible? I'm going to start with Max on this one, if that's okay. That's you.
What?
Yeah.
Right, and just to digest this quickly, really, I think it's during the R&D stages, that is when you can really explore a lot of different options in terms of making your piece accessible in a variety of ways. If you want your production to be in the dark, then, okay, we can try and see how it goes. Maybe you can have an interpreter in a glow-in-the-dark outfit or something, I don't know. But during the research and development stages, I think that's when often you can find some funding and you get that initial funding, and that you can bring up the stage within the R&D that you need another stage to look into the accessibility options. That would be my only suggestion off the top of my head. But please don't employ glow-in-the-dark interpreters. I don't think that's actually
Perhaps. I was going to take that one back to work. Michael, can I ask you to chip on that one?
Yeah, I think it's about. I think it's how you focus the work, and I think there's lots of work that's created by artists to reflect their artistic practice. But the minute you want it to be accessible, then you absolutely have to start thinking about the audience first. I mean, you should be thinking about the audience anyway. It's about interaction between the performers and the audience. But if you specifically want to make it accessible, then you have to put the audience first. And that might mean compromising a bit of your own artistic practice, I guess.
Thank you. Question in the middle? Yeah. Good sign.
My name is Roger. You really start in front of the captions. I'm a retired interpreter. I retired 18 months ago. I have interpreted theatre performances back in the day at the Unicorn Theatre. At the time, I was recently finishing my career as a teacher of the deaf and moved on to become a full-time interpreter. The Unicorn Theatre approached me and they said to me, "You know the audience and you know how to adapt this play for children." So I was interpreting, I was being very visual, and the children weren't looking at me, they were looking at the performance. Interpreting for theatre for children is a waste of time and a waste of money. Because how can they comprehend that this man over here is saying what they're saying over there? It's ridiculous. I have been to many, many interpretive theatre performances. I've seen some fantastic interpreters, but it was actually a complete waste of time. There is one very well-known performance space in London where they always provide interpreters dressed in black, in the spotlight, in the corner, and they sell cheap tickets to the deaf community. The deaf people are looking at the captions. Nobody is looking at the interpreter. And the theatre don't know. They're paying the interpreter a very good wage, and it's actually a bit of a waste of time. I think most theatre interpreting is a bit of a waste of time. I've probably only seen a handful of performances that were successful, one of them being at the Bush Theatre. It was a one-woman show called The Interpreter. I don't know if any of you have seen it. We had the performer and an interpreter on stage, and they were moving and mirroring each other throughout the performance, and it was fantastic to watch. I could go on that real emotive journey, and at the end we had a Q&A, and all the hearing people didn't realise that the interpreter wasn't actually part of the show. So that was a successful model. I think if it's a 1 or 2 person performance, it will be successful. But if your cast members are going over that, it's a waste of time. And I want to hone in on what Sula said, that sometimes a show is not worth interpreting. And I think interpreters themselves should have the integrity to say no and leave. So perhaps in the end you may have fewer shows that are interpreted, but the quality that will be provided will be of a standard that the access is sufficient. Yes, the preparation is needed with the actors and also with the audience. That's one key point. As a hearing patron, we go with a lot of pre-assumed knowledge which deaf people don't have. So you need that preparation. You need to ensure that everything is just right. If it's not right, then what's the point?
No, thank you, Roger. There's some excellent points in there. I think there was another thing which was actually raised earlier as well. This is completely my personal experience about the suitability of some shows. And I've certainly been guilty of captioning a show, well, booking captioners for a show, and 2 months later being told by the director of said show that they'd taken out all the words. Which was disappointing. I'm actually going to have to sadly wrap it up there because we are running very short of time, and I appreciate that everyone still has a lot of questions burning inside them, which is why I always like a call to action. So please do take this forward, as people in business meetings often say. If anyone can work on research and development or offer workshop space, I think there are lots of people in this room who would be very keen to see how we can produce exactly the sorts of rehearsals that we're talking about, and exactly how we bring deaf people either into the R&D phase or get that audience talking to the people who actually create theatre and who create interpretation. So please, 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 let's make all of these interesting thoughts, take these interesting thoughts, and turn them into actions. That would be great. I would very much like to thank our panel. Obviously, so that's Max, Paula, Louis, Michael and Sula. Thank you very much. You've done a great job.